Welcome to this presentation on mosses for Taxonomy and Identification Module Coursework 2. What are mosses? Mosses evolved long before vascular plants, at least 400 million years ago, and are found across the world in every habitat apart from salt water. There is still much to learn about them as they are relatively understudied compared to vascular plants, and lack of identification skills can mean they are lumped together by non-specialists when carrying out ecological surveys. There are at least 11,000 known species worldwide. Mosses are poikilohydric, i.e. they don't have a vascular system to carry water and nutrients to maintain turgidity, nor do they have roots. Instead, rhizoids help them to adhere to the substrate, and their leaf tissues are just 1 or 2 cells thick to enable them to take up moisture and nutrients quickly. Many species are adapted to be able to take in carbon dioxide even in low light and temperature conditions or when desiccated. Mosses generally have two forms, acrocarpus and pleurocarpus. Acrocarpus mosses form distinct little cushions and their stems are mostly unbranched. Pleurocarpus mosses form mats on the ground and their stems can be branched 2 or 3 times, bi- or tripinnate. Size can vary from the minuscule to large carpets in grassland. Where are mosses found? In terms of habitats and distribution, it's probably easier to list where mosses aren't found, i.e. saltwater marine habitats. Otherwise, they're mostly found in habitats with high humidity, such as woodlands. They may grow on the ground, on dead wood, on banks and rocky substrates, disturbed ground, sand dunes, reefs and concrete paths, or high up in trees. They favour trees with alkaline bark. In the UK, this is ash, willow, sycamore and poplar. Some species, such as Bryon pallescens, can tolerate substrates with high levels of heavy metals such as mine spoil, while others exist in polar or desert habitats. Syntrichia canyonervis, for example, collects water via grooves in its leaf hair tips. Equally, many species are found in aquatic habitats such as rivers and lakes. Mosses are generally more abundant in higher latitudes, the opposite of vascular plants. In boreal and Arctic regions, where vascular plants are all but absent, mosses and other bryophytes are major contributors to net primary production within the ecosystem. However, they're also abundant in tropical rainforests. In bogs, sphagnum species are abundant thanks to their tolerance of extremely acidic habitats, contrary to the other moss families, which need alkaline conditions. This acidity and the resulting anaerobic conditions and reduction in speed of decomposition is responsible for the creation of peat and peatlands. Peatlands are mostly found in temperate and boreal regions, but they also occur in the tropics. Temperate peatlands cover around 3.5 million square kilometres, tropical peatlands around 1/10 of this, and mostly in Indonesia. Mosses are abundant within the Palearctic ecozone. This map from a 2001 review by Mikhail Ignatov shows moss species richness across the Palearctic. Each number represents the number of species found in that area in hundreds, so a 2 means there are 200 to 299 species in that region. There is far greater species richness on the eastern and western seaboards than in the vast plains of the central zone. In addition, mountainous areas such as the Alps, the Pyrenees and the Western Iberian Peninsula also have high species richness. However, there are also pockets of high diversity in other inland areas reflecting more pristine habitats. Deserts or plains are less diverse in general, and this is reflected in the bryophyte flora in these locations. The Western and Northern Palearctic alone have nearly 1,700 species. That's around 15% of the global total. Surprisingly, mosses occur in arid regions too. The Middle East and Middle Asia are home to many species that have adapted to xeric conditions and extremes of temperature. Endemism varies across the Palearctic. Approximately 10% of species in the Middle East and Middle Asia are endemic. The Russian Far East, China and Japan, mountainous regions and Macaronesia also have high endemism. The biggest family of mosses within the Palearctic is the Potiaceae, with more than 300 species across 40 genera. This family also has the largest number of endemic species. Ignatov also found major differences in species composition between the Western and Eastern Palearctic. The UK and Ireland are home to more than 1,000 moss species, That's 2/3 of all the species found in Europe. Our position on the edge of the Atlantic and reliably cool, humid climate make for ideal moss habitat. Indeed, some British and Irish species are globally rare. Mosses are extremely important to the carbon and nitrogen cycles. Mosses decompose more slowly than vascular plants, therefore they can accumulate and sequester carbon in such quantities as to be globally important. Forest floor mosses can capture carbon dioxide emitted from decomposition and soil respiration. As mentioned earlier, net primary production from bryophytes can be greater than that of the vascular overstory in northern and temperate rainforests where the mosses dominate the forest floor. In northern and boreal regions, mosses are the dominant vegetation cover. Here, some species form symbiotic relationships with cyanobacteria, nostoc species for example, to fix atmospheric nitrogen into a form available to plants. In some cases, mosses sequester the nitrogen, stopping vascular plants from using it. When desiccated mosses are re-wetted, they release carbon, nitrogen and phosphorus, creating nutrient flushes for other organisms. Mosses and other bryophytes are pioneers of disturbed areas, newly formed soils and hard surfaces such as rocks. They can even trigger succession in aquatic systems by creating enough organic matter to transform a water body into a terrestrial system. Pioneer moss species have been shown to fix nitrogen at much higher rates, increasing soil development for other species to colonise. Dead moss has relatively little nitrogen and therefore decomposes slowly. This material captures other organic debris and together they begin to develop a humus layer. Where mosses grow on the soil surface, they provide services to the soil column, such as temperature regulation, insulating against and reducing the effects of fluctuating temperatures above. For example, in polar and boreal regions, they buffer the permafrost against surface temperature fluxes. They also regulate humidity within the soil column, filtering rainwater and reducing soil erosion. Mosses and other bryophytes intercept moisture from the atmosphere, for example in foggy conditions, releasing it slowly. This is particularly important to forest hydrological cycles as it maintains humid conditions within the forest canopy and understory during drier weather. In coniferous forest, this vapour contribution is as much as 25% of the total forest water vapour. Mosses have considerable water holding capacity, and so in carpeting a forest or grassland floor, they provide a vast reservoir for the ecosystem. This also helps to reduce the severity of wildfires. Bryophytes in general are very sensitive to even slight changes in humidity or other factors, and as such they are key indicators of climate change in forest habitats. Mosses provide habitat for hundreds of thousands of organisms such as protozoa, tardigrades, nematodes and mites, many of which are found in a film of water around the moss tissue. In some habitats, mite density may reach 650,000 mites per square metre of moss. All of these organisms are a key part of ecosystem functioning, performing roles such as detritifery and nitrogen fixation. Numerous macroinvertebrates such as beetles, worms and springtails also live or overwinter in mosses. In fact, there can be multiple trophic layers within moss invertebrate communities. Mosses also provide larval habitat and food resources for some primitive Lepidoptera, some of which are adapted to look like mosses. For example, the Celerio sister butterfly in Panama. Sphagnum species help to create conditions for carbon sequestration. They thrive in waterlogged or riparian environments such as bogs and acidic flushes. Bogs can be 20 metres deep in places, and therefore much of the decomposition that goes on in them is anaerobic, taking much longer than in aerobic conditions, and so carbon dioxide and methane is released much more slowly. Peatlands throughout the world sequester large amounts of atmospheric carbon. Species such as sphagnum are also able to use methane as a carbon source. A 2002 study by Moore calculated that temperate peatlands sequester up to 12% of human carbon emissions, around 455 gigatons at the time of the study. This is approximately 25% of all of the Earth's soil carbon. Unsurprisingly, given its favoured habitat, sphagnum is able to take up nitrogen well, especially in boreal peatlands, but it does not respond favourably to excess nitrogen deposition. Sphagnum has high cation exchange ability, which can make the surrounding environment more acidic and therefore inhibit vascular plants and microbial growth. In the UK, we are familiar with vascular plants such as wood anemone and bluebell being ancient woodland indicators, but a German study by Mulder et al. In 2015 found that several moss species could be used in the same way. One group was indicative of highly humid, base-rich, semi-natural deciduous woodland, while another was linked to acidic beech and oak woods. Yet another group was representative of recently planted woodland. Many bird species use moss to line their nests. Who hasn't seen a blackbird throwing bits of moss off a roof in an effort to find the best pieces for their nest? Long-tailed tits weave mosses, lichens and spider silk together to create nests that expand as their brood grows. Climate change will affect moss community composition through rising temperatures and higher nitrogen and sulphur levels. Global warming is already causing permafrost to melt, and rising temperatures lead to Arctic greening because plants are able to colonise further north, encroaching on the tundra and causing the decline of mosses and lichens. This in turn will increase the albedo effect, creating a positive feedback loop. Conserving mosses and other bryophytes will ensure ecosystems continue to function properly. If the moss layer disappears, the organisms and processes it supports will also disappear. At present, the bryosphere is a carbon sink, but in a warming climate, this is likely to change, especially if humans continue to damage peatlands. Carbon uptake in most mosses is generally limited by too little or too much water, but in sphagnum it is only limited by too little water. Therefore, draining bogs for agriculture and forestry will reduce sequestration, as will summer droughts. Dry conditions will make conditions more favourable for trees, which will then drain the bogs further through transpiration and the albedo effect, which is normally low in bogs. Reduced water will mean conditions within the bogs becoming aerobic, speeding up decomposition and increasing carbon dioxide and methane emissions, hence the possibility of the bogs becoming carbon sources rather than sinks. Work is underway to restore some bogs, but peat extraction continues worldwide, mostly from raised bogs. This has grave implications for carbon sequestration and flood risk. Unlike upland temperate peatlands, lowland tropical peatlands have high rates of endemism among their flora and fauna, which will be lost forever if they are logged or drained for agriculture. Dried out bogs also have a greater risk of catching fire, which causes serious air pollution. The alkaline bark of ash trees is a major habitat for many moss species in the UK. Ash dieback could have dire consequences for these mosses. Removing deadwood may slow the spread of the disease, but it also removes substrate for bryophytes. Mosses have great potential as indicator species in climate modelling. They're found in almost all environments, terrestrial and aquatic, and are able to colonise surfaces that are out of bounds to vascular plants, making them a useful barometer of ecosystem health. Harmans et al. In 2011 found that nitrogen levels in mosses can be used to illustrate nitrogen deposition across large spatial scales, highlighting areas at greater risk from atmospheric pollution. A 2012 study by Cheshin et al. Found that bryophytes prefer fast-flowing rivers with clear, cool water and a low nutrient load, and therefore have potential as bioindicators to monitor the health of river systems. In terms of climate change and community composition, scientists use the bryosphere and its small-scale, short-term processes as a miniature version of larger-scale ecosystems, testing theories on ecological relationships and processes such as metapopulations, habitat fragmentation and migration relatively inexpensively. Theories showing promise are then scaled up and tested further. As mosses are often specific to particular environmental conditions or gradients, they can also be used to compare management methods and monitor the ecological state of habitats and landscapes. Sphagnums may aid in habitat classification through remote sensing. Different colours occur at different locations. For example, red bog moss occurs in damp areas on the side of flushes, while the dark green cowhorn bog moss is also found in inundated parts of ponds and flushes. Moss's tolerance of extreme habitats, together with their wide-ranging and variable distribution and role as indicator species, is what makes them and other bryophytes so important to conservation and monitoring. They may be small, but they can tell us a great deal about environmental change and the condition of ecosystems. Identification difficulties can mean that species are under-recorded, which is problematic, for example, when assessing distribution and monitoring for responses to changing climatic conditions. Some moss species are highly variable in appearance, some have male and female forms. Not all species have capsules. For those that do, capsules may not always be present at collection. Some reproduce vegetatively via gemmae and bulbils. Some have distinguishing features that can only be seen when the moss is desiccated, such as leaves spiralling together. That said, mosses generally favour a particular habitat, such as woodland or arable fields, and many are regional or only found in very limited areas, and so it's possible to narrow down an identification this way. The British Biological Society Field Guide, Mosses and Liverworts of Britain and Ireland, is fantastic and has a very useful key. However, it's also very heavy for a field guide and the photographs aren't always detailed enough. Pauli's Arable Bryophytes has more limited coverage, but contains plenty of information on ID tips and distribution, as well as colour photography. The Roger Phillips book only has a selection of mosses, as well as grasses, lichens, liverworts, etc. It's also too large to be used in the field. There are many regional guides covering mosses or bryophytes found, for example, in the Berks, Bucks and Oxon area or West Wales. These can be helpful in that the reader has limited options from which to choose, and therefore confusion with the species that does not occur in that locality is less likely. They're also very portable. There are several regional atlases and a national one, but these do not help greatly with identification. Other books are in black and white or have drawings, or don't have a key. The diminutive size of most mosses means a hand lens is necessary as a minimum. Some species need a microscope to see features and tell apart. However, not everyone has access to a microscope. It takes practice to use a key, and you can end up going off on tangents if not familiar with the terminology associated with this group or their anatomy. The expert biologists I've encountered have built up their knowledge over a lifetime of study. Training courses are unfortunately few and far between in the UK. As I say, knowledge built up over decades is lost because many are elderly and these experts are going to have to retire or pass away. On Twitter and Facebook, the British Biological Society and others are happy to help with IDs if you can provide a photo.